Hello, welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. It is another chapter in our volume cycle of self-aware horror. And I do believe I chose this movie knowing that I had never seen it before. So we're going to be doing Dead Alive, aka Braindead, in the rest of the world. I think it's just Dead Alive in the United States. Which is a movie that I've always wanted to see but never got around to it. And joining us is a very special guest. Chris, do you want to introduce Brian for us?
Yeah, Brian Eggert from Deep Focus Review is here. I've been reading Brian's stuff for quite a while. I've in fact used excerpts from some of his deep dives and reviews for my own high school film studies class that I teach. So I'm super excited to welcome you. Hey, Brian, thanks for joining us on Film Trace.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invite, and I'm honored that you teach my stuff in your class. I actually I kind of write my stuff for young film students. Some of those definitives essays that I write on
Nice.
deepfocusreview.com, and I'm always interested to learn that I'm highly plagiarized. So if you see somebody and it doesn't sound like their voice in their paper, you might want to do a plagiarism check. I've been told by some instructors that I get plagiarized a lot, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I've been writing for probably 15 years. 15 years this year, actually, almost to the month.
Nice.
On Deep Focus Review, and kind of balance things between new release reviews and then kind of go into more academic writing for this line of definitives essays, which are I don't have any illusions about it. I was inspired by Roger Ebert's great movies section and kind of the essentials on TCM, and have just taken a more of an academic bent on those. And then I have a Patreon that I do, and but yeah, I kind of feel like, even though I've been doing this for 15 years, I sort of just kind of made it a little bit this year. I was inducted into Rotten Tomatoes, which is
I was going to
kind of
ask you about
validating.
this. That's amazing. You're our first Rotten Tomatoes approved critic on here.
Oh, really?
You're a celebrity.
Wow, yeah. I don't want to put too much stock in it or anything, but I after writing that much for so long, and I just feel kind of like it takes care of some imposter syndrome stuff that I've
of course.
that everybody kind of think who talks about movies online deals with.
Of course.
So,
No, absolutely.
yeah. So yeah, it's I'm happy to be here though.
Great.
Nice. Yeah, we appreciate it. I think that this will be a particularly interesting one to get your viewpoint on, because like you said, some of your definitive stuff, it makes a lot of sense that you say you're influenced by Roger Ebert's great movies, and this is kind of Dead Alive / Brain Dead, one of those great movies, but not in the traditional sense, right?
Right.
I'm curious, since Dan, you already said that this is your first watch of Braindead. What's your personal history with it, Brian?
So I kind of, not to go in the second movie that we're talking about, but I came into sort of splatter or melt movies, that sort of cult movie horror aesthetic in the early 90s, largely through Army of Darkness and Evil Dead. So one of the first, I would stay up late at night when I was, probably like 10 and watch like USA Up All Night, and I think I caught Army of Darkness on there, and I got so interested in Army of Darkness and Bruce Campbell and sort of like the whole Briscoe County Jr. aspect of it all, that I started looking up what else he was in, and then I found Evil Dead 2, and I'm like, okay, this is sort of, this is fun when you're a 10 or 12-year-old kid. And then I, randomly just bought Evil Dead 2 on VHS and wanted to learn more, and gradually just, started finding more of these movies. And yeah, came to Dead Alive, before I saw, I think, Heavenly Creatures or any other Peter Jackson movies. And I think I didn't quite get the self-awareness at the time. I did sort of see a relationship between Sam Raimi and Peter Jackson. And I came to understand later that Peter Jackson was very, very much influenced by him. But yeah, I enjoyed it very much on a very base level when I was when I was an early teen or pre-adolescent, and have really come to still appreciate that on various intellectual levels, actually, which is seems kind of hard to do actually when you're watching the movie and blood's everywhere. How is this intellectually satisfying? And I think it's more just the cult aspect of movie viewership that interests me now. Um, I studied kind of cult aesthetics and cult consumption in when I was getting my master's degree, and just sort of appreciate it now on that level. So that's where I'm at with it.
Nice. Yeah, I'm kind of splitting the difference between the two of you. I saw the Evil Dead movies with my older brother as a teen, but I just knew Dead Alive as that one movie with that iconic VHS cover at Blockbuster, and I'd always seen it, but there was never any quite enough push when I was that young to actually grab it. And it wasn't until Frighteners came out in '96 when all of a sudden that was probably my first exposure to Peter Jackson, and I almost didn't know a lot better necessarily, because I know that's not seen as typically a high point of the man's career, in retrospect. But that hooked me specifically. That was one of the first early instances, I think, as a teenager, where I'm like, wow, what he's doing with the camera is fascinating. And so then I think it was in college. That's when Netflix DVDs, one at a time by mail, became prevalent for Dan and I, anyways. And that was one of the first ones where I was just like, I've got to finally see this movie. And so I have a really distinct memory, because my randomly assigned roommate was a frat bro kind of guy, and I actually had the 2 at a time Netflix subscription, and so I got Dead Alive and Bicycle Thieves in the mail at the same time.
What a mixture. Wow.
And so I watched both of them the same night, and that was it was early on sophomore year of college, and that immediately then my roommate was just like, this dude's a fucking weirdo, what is he watching?
Yeah.
So
I mean, Bicycle Thieves maybe, but Dead Alive, oh my, dear Lord.
Just the 2 of those back to back is what a double feature.
I'll tell you, I was not ready for this movie.
Yes.
I was
Tell
not
me
ready
about
at all.
that, Dan.
And I'm not I'm not the biggest guy into gore. It's not one of my favorite aspects of the horror genre, but I'll do it. I like the Romeo Strap and Tom Savini and his work. But this was just the thing that blew me away about watching this for the first time is how tight the movie is and how quick it is, how much ground it covers plot wise in the first 40 minutes. It's kind of insane. It's just extremely filled to the brim with plot and unbelievable gore and just pitch black satire. It kind of blew me away how good it is. I was just not expecting that, because I came to Peter Jackson through The Frighteners, and I liked that movie growing up, and odd film, but nothing indicated. And you look at his Lord of the Rings stuff. Do you think there's any indication of where he came from here? What I mean, or Bad Taste even before this, which I think was his first film, right? How do you guys see a connection, a bridge between this stuff and the huge blockbuster, biggest films ever that he made, Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit stuff? Do you guys find a connection there?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the way he's moving the camera in the Lord of the Rings, I actually just rewatched the Lord of the Rings movies a couple weeks ago, and the Hobbit movies, and the way he's moving the camera in those movies and getting right up into the orcs' faces is very similar to what he's doing in this movie. Getting up in zombies' faces as they're screaming and whatnot. I mean, they're the same angles. And actually, rewatching the Hobbit movies, I never noticed in the last one, the Battle of the Five Armies, there's a orc named Bolg that is the second in command orc, and it's the same head of Henrietta in Evil Dead 2. If you look, it's very similar. It's strikingly similar. So I think he's constantly injecting these sort of zombie movie aesthetics into the Lord of the Rings. It's just sort of high fantasy blended with that, and they may be considered impersonal, I think, to some of his fans of his earlier horror movies, but I see the connection very closely.
The one thing that stood out to me in seeing Dead Alive is the close-ups and the medium close-ups.
Yeah,
it's constant. Now, why do you think? Let's get into the technical side of things. Why do you think that he? I mean, literally, I noticed this within the first 20 minutes, and then I couldn't unsee it for the rest of the movie. And he pulls the camera out later on as we get to the party, as we get to the lawnmower scene, stuff like that. But why do we think he's so close up? And it's almost like a grotesque angle he's constantly going for.
It's really jarring in the first.
Yeah.
Yes.
I watched Evil Dead 2 in preparation for this, and then I rewatched Dead Alive, and I mean, Evil Dead 2 is like a 10, like at a level 10 for in terms of intensity, and this just blows it off the scale. I mean,
absolutely, it does. Somehow, I watched it right afterwards. I was like, well, this is kind of boring. Like, this is, you know,
right. Which is not something you should be saying about Evil Dead 2 because it's an insane movie, but he really leans into this kind of off kilter and you know, just the whole off kilterness of it all is actually something that's really associated with New Zealand cinema, I've learned.
Interesting.
There's this documentary called, actually made by Sam Neill, called Cinema of Unease from 1995. Yeah. And he just makes all these links between New Zealand as a culture and this whole off-kilter perspective, like specifically these dark, kind of gross out and bad taste films. And so all these filmmakers are making these connections between New Zealand culture and just being sort of off. And I feel like he really embraces that, obviously, in this movie, but you're also seeing that in things like, you know, Jane Campion's Sweetie, or like the 2006 movie Black Sheep. Have you ever saw that? It's a New Zealand horror movie about zombified sheep. It's just this, the world is very off kilter in New Zealand cinema for some reason, and I don't know that I buy into the argument that all of New Zealand cinema is like that, because you just see exceptions everywhere, but there is something unique in specifically Peter Jackson's cinema where everything seems off, and it's a world unto itself. And so, yeah, I think, you know, from the first shots of just that kind of that rocky Skull Island where they're at in the first scenes, the camera angles are just wild.
Do we think? I wonder if. Well, Chris, go ahead. What are you gonna say?
Oh, I was gonna just add even with like the relationship dynamics, the character development here, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, Dan, like that briskness to it. It's those moments are like super intense before there's even a drop of blood on screen. Like you have those really kind of visceral close-ups in the, you know, burgeoning romance between the two leads, and that. I mean, I feel like I could have just watched that, and you end up seeing that aspect a little more with like Heavenly Creatures, and going back to what you said, Brian, about the connections with Lord of the Rings, like that's what still makes a lot of those moments work, even if you're not dealing with like the fantastical elements of Tolkien's world building. There's still that, like, there's a reason why this guy has, you know, basically mastered epic in scope fantasy cinema. It feels like on the surface they're two worlds apart, but you have such a kind of clear-headedness about it. Like there's this confidence about it that feels just like, I mean, I can't imagine like what, I can't think of an American filmmaker or a British filmmaker that comes out the gate like that. And so maybe there is something to that, you know, geographical, historical argument, but it feels so refreshing when, at least for me, like the vast majority of the films I'm watching are American, and, you know, not ever really trying to be that in your face. Right. There's one quote from Jackson back when the film originally came out in New Zealand, and I mean, we will get into this, I'm sure, with the balance between humor and horror, as there tends to be in these kind of self-aware horror films, and like you mentioned earlier, Brian, the splatter genre in general, which really is kind of under the surface of mainstream horror, at least in America, during the 80s and 90s. and he spoke about how one of his idols was actually Buster Keaton, and this is kind of one of the key elements, I think, of Buster Keaton's longevity as a filmmaker and as an actor and as a performer is that in your faceness. Like, there, you can watch Sherlock Jr. or The General 100 years later and it still feels like exhilarating. And I really think, like, it's just exciting to think about how, like, Dead Alive can keep getting rediscovered over the years, and there's no waning value, even considering like the antiquated stop motion animation and prosthetics. It's still just like hilariously fun, and it's timeless.
Yeah, I think there's a certain I don't know. I saw that quote about Buster Keaton, and not that his influences are his influences, but I felt like it was more like Jerry Lewis and Looney Tunes watching it.
Sure, yeah.
The physical comedy that he's doing is just a bungling Lionel. He's just bungling and falling over himself and running into things and trying to get a piece of licorice, I think, and knocking over things. And it's just, and he's so awkward, and the camera angles are just exaggerating everything. So I didn't see the Buster Keaton connection, and I felt it was broader than that.
Sure. Yeah. I can see that. I think the element that still feels true to me is like the wizardry aspect of it, where it's just like Buster Keaton was basically like a magician on film, right?
Sure.
And that kind of like brazenness, he literally like broke his bones on sets to get the kind of shot he wanted, and that just like that risking it all kind of feeling. But I think you're totally right. Like the cartoonishness, right? It's like literally feels like you're painting with blood on screen,
right.
like you would paint for a Tex Avery cartoon or something. What did you think, Dan, when, like, in terms of like looking at the history of horror? I'm curious, especially watching it in 2022 for the first time. What did you like? Yeah, it felt so one of a kind, I'm sure. But is there any like connectiveness there that you noticed?
I mean, I think for me, and there's a great quote in here about how Jackson did not want to make a serious horror film. And then obviously it's so obvious the intention here is a comedy. I mean, it's a horror film in the sense that it's gory, but it leads with comedy through and through. And trying to think about other similar movies, obviously the Evil Dead stuff, Reanimator would be another precursor. Return of the Living Dead. It kind of fits all in that world, but this one feels a little bit different than those. Like the parody element here is more focused on society at large, and it's not sort of self-reflexive on the horror genre. Like Return of the Living Dead would be a good example. There's something, I don't know, it feels a little bit like an Outlander to me in terms of the history of horror a bit. I don't know, Brian, what do you think? You probably have a better sort of scope here and where this would fit in.
Well, I think I don't see as many direct references as other films, as other horror movies are making throughout the 80s, but I do see the kind of one-upmanship of effects that's going on throughout the 80s, where Joe Dante sees a horror movie and decides he can do better and I can do grosser if I apply a certain amount of a better werewolf transition, or I can do a grosser zombie effect, or Tom Savini doing trying to outdo Dawn of the Dead with Day of the Dead. And so I see like him looking at the Evil Dead movies or the Reanimator or Society and saying, well, I can do grosser. And so you have this conversation happening from one filmmaker to the next that, at least in this movie, there's not a lot of direct references, but I think it's part of that conversation. And then I guess from another horror aspect, I was trying to think of a horror movie in the 90s that continues that conversation after this, and I didn't really see that. I couldn't really find an example that came up until maybe like Slither, and by then you're using special effects shots. I think 92 Death Becomes Her comes out, and it's CGI now. We can do all this stuff with CGI, so why spend months building these prosthetics and whatnot when we can just CGI it?
Yeah.
Which is crazy when you look at it, because the budget here is only $3 million.
Yeah.
Right.
It looks unbelievable for that amount of money.
Yeah.
Like I don't even know what the time to shoot this was, but it had to be not an easy shoot.
I think I read that it was 11 weeks.
Okay.
I guess that's not that bad, actually. I mean, that's not terrible. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing too. Like, looking back on it now, it's considered the goriest film ever made. That's what people say. Or they say the most blood ever used on screen before. That's its claim to fame. But looking closer at the movie and actually seeing it now from its infamous status, there's so much more going on here than gore, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's multiple layers of satire. It's going. I didn't even realize it was a period piece. Looking back at it, because I was like looking at this, I was like, oh, is this what New Zealand is back in the 90s, the late 80s? But no, it's set in the 1950s. I mean, it's very pointed, I would say, in terms of what it's trying to critique in New Zealand society, which can be replicated in America, Australia, or England. And it just, that's the thing. What is interesting to me, and comparing it to Evil Dead, and this is kind of my take on it. But Evil Dead 2 is great, fun, interesting, a mile a minute type movie. I did not feel like there was a huge satirical societal criticism undercurrent to it. I didn't really feel it or see it. With this movie, that is the undercurrent of the entire thing. Mm-hmm. And like all of the gore and the great set pieces are wonderful sort of leaves, but the core, the core and roots of the film is that satire that is going on. And it's not just the satire of that society, but also this interesting little story about an overpowering parent. And sort of that whole, can we say Freudian? Is that sort of what's going on there?
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you got? What's your take on that sort of juxtaposition that's happening here?
I feel like there's like two layers in particular. At the end, I don't even know if I saw either layer when I originally watched it as a sophomore in college, because I think especially that first kind of surface level is just the sheer looniness of it all. So then, like, once you break it down, and I think, like, kind of what I was saying earlier, the relationship aspects and character development beats still very much work, even though Peter Jackson is out completely honest and says, like, he kind of just shoehorned those in there because he knew that that's what it took to, like, make the story of a film and the propulsion of a narrative work for it. But yes, it's very much soaked in that kind of really Freudian, but there's also like that xenophobic aspect of Paquita's character, mm-hmm. and the patriarchal misogynist aspect of the uncle character. I forget what the relationship is there, but he also becomes the character that, even though there's not any direct like titles referenced, he is the one that kind of breaks the fourth wall a little bit by mentioning, like, when the zombies are attacking the kitchen, he says, like, I've read the comics, I know what we need to do, like, and that kind of goes back to your point, Brian, about the cartoon aspect to it and the almost like pulp. It's essentially like this pulp reference point, so that you have the meta kind of postmodern aspect to it, but then completely this callback to almost like Psycho Hitchcock kind of character dynamics. And so there's like enough going on both of those levels that at any given moment, and there's also like a religious aspect with the priest character, which is iconic, right? Yeah. That there's just like, so it's so, but the best thing is, like, we kind of talked about this with regards to the new Scream. That movie feels completely overstuffed, but how is Jackson able to really like pack so much in here, but still make it feel breezy, like it's effortless?
Yeah. Yeah, there is a lot of kind of narrative thrust to this movie, and I completely agree with your point, Dan, about Evil Dead 2 not really having any of that. And now I'm sort of questioning why I prefer Evil Dead 2 to this movie, but just because there is a little bit more meat on these bones. I think there's also element of like the colonizer and just kind of
Yeah.
how they're treating any other race but white in this film, and that was just and I don't know if is that self-awareness, or is that commentary, or is that just maybe being a little naive and using easy jokes. I wasn't 100% sure, because I think they make there's not really, aside from Bakita, there's not really a character who isn't treated like an other, who's non-white. There's the the group of black transporters in the beginning who, they just say Singaya, and it's a comic moment. There's the comic rule of three where they cut off his hand, cut off his arm, and then splat, cut off his head. But it's kind of like they're just treated like a joke, and then they get their money and run off. And I don't know. I kind of felt uneasy about that, I guess, watching it this time. And maybe it is a comment on just sort of the historical racism of New Zealand, because there is a lot of it in that culture, but I haven't seen that anywhere else in Peter Jackson's filmography, really, to justify that. So,
yeah, I think there's an interesting quote from one of the writers, because technically the script is not just by Jackson; it's also by Stephen Sinclair and Fran Walsh, and the Fran Walsh quote is saying that it's essentially going back to like the meta argument about how, if at all, there is like a self-awareness here, if not about involving social commentary about the genre itself. So they wrote, we were really interested in the central idea, which is the inversion of the classic zombie story, where you've got people in a house being attacked from the outside. We really like the idea of inverting the story and having the zombies within the house having to be looked after, fed, sedated, and ultimately rehabilitated. Also, it worked on another level in that it was all about what's going on in the suburbs behind the net curtains, keeping up appearances. So there's kind of like that kind of have your cake and eat it too aspect to it, where it's like, I mean, it's a really like smart way to go about reviving, which even in the early 90s is already kind of a tired subgenre of horror, and yet that's in the DNA of the zombie movie, right? Going back to Romero's political ambitions behind those films. So I don't. Maybe there's not necessarily enough evidence, like you said, especially looking in comparison to other Peter Jackson movies, for too much of like the racial lens to be used on it. But I feel like there's enough evidence to say that there's self-awareness here to the point where they are, they know they're doing something smart and they're executing it very well. What did you think, Dan?
I mean, that's the one area here where it's like, from a self-awareness, social critique aspect of this movie, to me, definitely with the special effects, the one up mentioned in the 80s, that's a great point, Brian. I did not think about that at all, actually. But where maybe I struggle with the film a bit is in trying to place it within the other sort of films that we've talked about, like Scream, like Cabin in the Woods, and stuff like that. Whereas a lot of those movies were, trying to place themselves within this broader horror spectrum of filmmaking and comedy and all those films, and not here. It's like, especially from this quote you're talking about, this zombie story thing, that's where they lose me. I get the social criticism that they're going for in sort of upper middle class society and all these hierarchies and men over women, patriarchy. It's like that all adds up to me. What I don't get at all, and maybe I just don't have the reference points to really get it, but like in terms of this being a zombie movie, yeah, sure, I guess, but like where the zombie discourse was then at this point, this feels like a complete like other direction, not even related to the zombie thing that was happening, especially with Day of the Dead and Return of the Living Dead. Maybe it's a little bit closer to that. But like going back to Dawn of the Dead or Night of the Living Dead, those films were very extraordinarily dark, super cynical, and had like a pretty clear political satire not even satire, just political criticism within that movie. I did not find that here. I found some really good general sort of like, this is how society is and how it's screwed up, but pretty shallow and not really going all that deep. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Am I being unfair to Peter Jackson? Is there something deeper here going on? Not that I didn't, like that aspect of the film. It's just I have a hard time seeing that being there, this sort of deep political, social satire stuff, as being anything more than kind of frivolous.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of just the coat hanger on which this coat is hung. It's very thin. It doesn't amount to much, and it gives you some. In the necessity of a narrative, it gives you that, and it gives you a little to think about. But I don't think it's really about that at all. This is about a bunch of young filmmakers going out and just seeing what they can do and how gross they can get. And I think you mentioned the period aspect. I mean, how ambitious is that for?
Right.
What a strange choice. Like, why not? Instead of just setting it in a contemporary setting where things would be much easier to execute, now they have to get all kinds of vintage cars and vintage clothing and a certain, from my understanding, a certain aspect of New Zealand is sort of behind the times in terms of architecture or technology, but not that much. So they have to completely reshape their production for that period element, which is just odd and kind of impressive. But again, I don't think anyone watches this to get a grand commentary on anything. And the psycho setup, or Freudian setup, I think that's interesting. I guess it leads to some. Each one of these aspects leads to some really gross gore. So the whole element of Lionel and his mom really just builds up to that moment where Lionel gets consumed by the womb and then has to cut himself out. It's like they made that, it's like they wrote the story just so they could get that. Like, how gross is that? As opposed to really having, okay, well, I have these ideas and so let's build a story around that. No, it's I think the gore came first and everything else came afterward.
I think to give Jackson a little bit of credit, I think that while he is trying to be, utilitarian, like, I want this thing, so I know I need to do this thing, just to make the film function. He said back in '92 also that he wanted to make specifically a splatter film that non-splatter films could go see. And he thought that the humor diluted the gore to a point that is acceptable, but still there for fans. This is him still speaking. On the other hand, I'm not interested in making, quote, hardcore horror films like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer or even Texas Chainsaw Massacre, although I enjoy both those films. I like comedy too much. And so ultimately, like, the joke is what matters the most to him. And it just in that, he succeeds kind of disgustingly, to the point where maybe that those other, like, subtext threads, if you really want to dig for them, are there, but that's not the point. And I think that's fine. I think that like you said, there's enough gore to go around, that who cares?
Well, it's funny too, like there's a little sort of note, and there's an IMDb and some other websites that this is almost rated, essentially they would call it 15 is the certificate, in Britain it'd be like our PG-13 sort of,
right,
below R, because exactly what you said, the ratings people, who are notoriously sort of uptight people, right? Like MPA people, work at the MPA and the British Film Board of Film Classification. They saw it as, there's insane gore here, but it's all comedic. It's all within a comedic lens and frame. So it's like, why don't we just have people go out and see? And I think the actual excuse was that like young women would go see it and kind of be put off by it, which is why they gave it an 18 instead of a 15. I can't even, like, okay, how would this get rated today? It'd have to be an R, right? Maybe an NC-17.
I don't know. I think that there's an argument to be made for both, but I think ultimately, I don't know. What is the Dead Alive equivalent of today? You mentioned earlier, Dan, that it's known as using the most blood, and I think that's true if you're talking about like actual physical like liquid.
Yeah.
But there was a big deal since we've been talking about the franchise in conjunction with Dead Alive. It only makes sense that the remake of Evil Dead from
Oh, I was going to mention that.
2013,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They claim anyways that they used way more blood, but how much of that was CGI? I don't know.
That's probably
Have
the
you guys
closest
seen
movie.
Psycho Gorman?
No.
No, what?
Okay, so this came out last year. It was one of my favorite movies. It's so funny. It's basically the same tone of Dead Alive, and it's just insane. And they use just geysers of blood and a lot of practical effects, some computer special effects. But I think it's probably on Shudder if you guys have Shudder.
Mm-hmm.
It is so funny and so over the top, and that's really the only movie that I can think of aside from maybe Slither that
Mm.
really approaches these levels of comedy and horror. And none of the gore is meant to be scary or there's the thinnest plot attached to it, and it's just let's see how gross and funny we can get with it. Um, I highly recommend you check that out. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Added to my queue. Thank you, Brian.
And like, what's interesting about this movie too is that it did not do well on release.
Mm-hmm.
Right, bombed on release, had weird development stuff getting it distribution in the United States. When it does come out, people are like, "What?" Does like, I think it played in 11 theaters or something total, made like $200,000 in the United States. Then it has this big second life on video. I'm kind of wondering, like, horror comedy in general. You know, it's a weird kind of subgenre of horror. Has it ever been massive or huge? There's got to be examples of movies that were like really big, besides like Scary Movie, right? Where it's not just clear.
Shaun of the Dead.
Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah.
There you go. But
I mean, it was a
that
box
did
office
pretty
hit.
well. Like, it has like a big cachet, but like financially, I think it did decent. It's like $100 million movie in the United States. We can think of a horror comedy.
I mean, the closest thing I can think of is what we were talking about on the first episode of this batch of episodes, Happy Death Day. And then also, I feel like Freaky would have been even bigger.
Okay,
if
this
COVID
brings me
hadn't
to
happened.
another discussion that I have to have. I was going through a list of horror comedy films that were out there, and they list movies like Happy Death Day. They list like Scream.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's a massive distinction between a movie like Dead Alive and something like Happy Death Day.
Of course.
Well, what is that distinction?
Well, I mean, I think the splatter subgenre, it kind of takes care of that, but I don't know how. I feel like that was also very much like a period term from the 80s and early 90s. What do you think, Brian?
I think it has to do with where you're directing your laughter. So
Yeah.
Scream, I would agree, is a horror comedy because I'm constantly laughing throughout and I'm having fun while watching it. But I'm also jumping at the jump scares when a really well placed jump scare or a really thrilling chase through the house or something. I'm having moments of suspense, whereas this I'm laughing at it. And I'm supposed to be laughing at it. I'm laughing at the appropriate parts because that's where he wants me to laugh. Just like Wes Craven wants me to laugh and kind of be thrilled one second and laugh the next second, whether it's character interactions or the sense of relief I feel by a false scare. So I think they're both horror comedies in a way. It's just how I'm laughing at it or with it. It makes a difference.
Yeah, and I think you that's a pretty important distinction with, like, I don't know, I'm trying to rack my head for these kinds of modern day horror comedies. I do think the Happy Death Day, while it probably is more like a 60-40 split, it's still like not 100% like Dead Alive. Whereas, like, I don't know, I hate to bring it up because I very much don't like either of the films, but Zombieland is
definitely
outward comedy, but it's still trying to like do the horror story. But there's still just like not enough there to really make it successful in either category.
Freaky's kind of a good example too recently.
Okay.
Where it's kind of think of it's like Happy Death Day, but even more in the comedy. It's not really scary at all. Like it's just sort of like Vince Vaughn acting like a teenage girl, which is funny, right? It's inherently funny. Let's talk about Evil Dead 2. How do we connect this? I mean, they seem very similar in sort of the energy, the focus on gore being at the front of what's happening. The stories may be secondary. I would argue it's way more secondary in Evil Dead 2. And then the self-awareness element of him like redoing the first movie in a sense, the opening part of Evil Dead 2. How do you guys link these two together, you think?
Yeah, I think there's a definite element of like cartoonishness, but even more so in Evil Dead 2, I would argue. There's the whole midsection where Ash is alone in the cabin and he's just kind of dealing with his hand is very much like a Tom and Jerry cartoon, really. There's a mouse hole that's a half circle on the wall. I mean, I've never had mice, but I can't imagine that that's a real thing. This is it's a cartoon, and he's slamming things into his head and doing, I would say, more Buster Keaton style physical humor than Dead Alive in this movie. And so I think it's that level of leaning into the horror comedy, leaning into the comedy of it all.
Yeah, I think that that was honestly probably my introduction to horror comedy. I think maybe around the same time as Scream, but there's this kind of, and I remember it being basically jarring the first time I saw it, and then I don't think I had watched it in like a decade, so it was jarring again when I rewatched it last week. That opening where it's just like, wait, so like, does he have memory loss, or are we just like straight up not caring? And then of course you read it, but I'm super curious at the time when it gets released, like people can't Google things to find out that like Raimi didn't have the rights and ultimately became more of a reboot than a sequel. Like how is that received at the time? Did like, I know that ultimately it wasn't necessarily a hit, but it very much feels like that would shoot them in the foot. It's amazing that they were able to eke out Army of Darkness and for an even bigger budget. I don't know. What's your personal history with Evil Dead 2, Dan, especially in conjunction with the rest of the movies from the franchise?
Oh, I'd never seen it before.
What?
First time seeing it, yeah.
Really?
You've seen Evil Dead though, right?
Yeah, I've seen Evil Dead, but I've never seen Evil Dead 2 now. And I've never seen Army of Darkness.
What?
Oh, interesting.
Again, not my... It's just, I'm going to be honest, guys, I struggled through it. I struggled getting through it. It's just not my... I don't like gore for the sake of gore. Is kind of one of my things. And like Dead Alive is definitely 100% my limit. But it kept me going because of the story elements and the satire. There's something really clever going on. Evil Dead 2, it's very fun and it's exciting. It's just, it felt, I don't even know how to put it. Maybe it is that sort of splatter schlock, like type of genre stuff that I just like. Society is a good example where I saw that once. I'll never watch that movie again, ever. And I had a very similar sort of feel to this. Original Dead was more of a horror film in and of itself that had some of these exaggerated elements, whereas Evil Dead 2 is just a comedy with gore. Am I wrong in saying that? I'm being unfair.
I think of it as so. Back in I think 2009 when Drag Me to Hell came out, Sam Raimi called that film a spookablast movie, which is just a great term that I constantly think of now when I watch anything by Sam Raimi, because he's going for, I think in this movie, just a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
And it's a sensation machine, and it's a very well ratcheted. I mean, Dan, you mentioned how well put together Dead Alive is, and
Sure.
I think personally, I think this film outdoes that in terms of just its construction. Every shot goes into the next one perfectly. And it's like it seems like yes, it's a splatter movie, and it seems like it could all just be random, but it's very well put together, like clockwork almost. And I think, Edgar Wright, for instance, his editing style is really takes from this, where every shot leads into, the camera is anticipating the next shot. And I love that about it. So I feel like, yes, it's not a movie where I feel profound emotions or care much about the story really at all, but I kind of just sit back and watch great filmmaking happen in front of me. And I prefer that. Whereas I feel, at least in comparison to Dead Alive is a little bit messier and, I don't know, not as well constructed, despite it being a well constructed movie. It's just not as well constructed as Evil Dead 2, I think.
It definitely doesn't have that kind of cohesiveness that Evil Dead 2 has, where it literally feels like you said, a clockwork. It made me that your use of that word made me think of, and it's a conversation Dan and I've had in several other episodes, that idea of cinema as a thrill ride rather than as like necessarily a thing where you get to wrestle with stuff. So what I'm curious about, though, Dan, is because there are a lot of connections between Evil Dead 2 and Dead Alive. What was it that like disgusted you in Evil Dead 2 that didn't in Dead Alive?
It's the fact that in Dead Alive, it is a pretty basic story, but a story is being told.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a character.
So it's more the lack of story.
Oh yeah, that's 100% what it is. Like the Evil Dead 2 scripts, I don't even. I mean, from a technical perspective, from a craftsmanship perspective, 100%. There's all these amazing things that are going on in this movie, some groundbreaking stuff. But I just think from like a story perspective, and I'm a story guy, right? That's like what I watch for in movies always is the story and the beats and the emotional narrative. There is no emotional narrative in Evil Dead 2. Like it is essentially, it's a theme park ride, like you guys are saying, sensation machine. I think that to me, that's where the difference is. We're on Dead Alive, there was something I could hold on to, at least like a panic bar or something, where it's like, oh, this is where the story's going. I'm okay. This is how we're going to navigate these rapids. Whereas with Evil Dead, I felt like it's completely out of control. And maybe that's the appeal of it, where it's just like boom, 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 boom. You have no idea where it's going to go. And it's interesting that like you brought up, Brian, the technical aspect of like the camera moving towards the next shot and it being set up like clockwork. The thing that sort of stood out to me was sort of the nonsensical nature of what was happening. In the sense that like technically they're moving from shot to shot, but like nothing's, it's like a self-contained sort of narrative that they're working on that's completely absurdist. So on the one hand, it's technically amazing. On the other hand, it's sort of like, well, where's the thread of the story that you're telling? And I think for me, it's like I'm so obsessed with that sort of stuff that like that's where I struggled with the movie a little bit. I was just sort of like, this is crazy and gonzo and amazing, but just give me that stupid Freudian subplot from Alive. You know what I mean? Like just give me just something a little bit to hold on to. But I honestly think that the appeal of Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, especially, and probably Arm of Darkness from what I hear, is that you don't need any of that. And that it's just sort of, it is what it is. It is fireworks. It's like fireworks of blood, essentially.
I think if you can appreciate that, the ways that Sam Raimi is manipulating his audience, and specifically like manipulating Bruce Campbell throughout the movie, then you kind of get, it's like you're watching from Raimi's perspective and just sort of appreciating how well he's manipulating you. And I think that kind of makes me think of Alfred Hitchcock and the way he just loved to manipulate an audience, and the way that he turned, if we're talking about horror comedy or kind of self-awareness or breaking taboos even with horror comedy and turning like the macabre into something that's funny. I mean, that all begins with Hitchcock with like, the guys who are talking about the best way to murder somebody in Shadow of a Doubt, or The Trouble with Harry. It's turning these macabre things into a kind of a sensation machine. They're as I said, they're it's thrilling, it's funny, and he's manipulating us every step of the way. And in the end, it's all just kind of a. It's like Raimi has told a practical joke, and the joke is on Ash because in the end he's fucked. And that's just kind of how each of them is. The Evil Dead ends the same way. He survives, and then the Force, comes and takes him, and then the movie's over. And Army of Darkness is, at least the director's cut, is the same way, where he's just sort of screwed in the end.
And I think there's that's inherently where the self-awareness comes from, because even though the obviously the comedic element, but in the script, in terms of dialogue, there's not nearly as much of the wink wink nudge nudge that you would see in everything from Dead Alive to Return of the Living Dead. And yet, that's what makes it such a kind of fun thrill ride, is because it's like you get to see the gears getting kind of becoming visible in front of you. That concept of like Bruce Campbell as Sam Raimi's Ragdoll, the thing that came to mind this time we were watching is like, this feels like how Christopher McQuarrie's treating Tom Cruise in every subsequent Mission Impossible movie.
Sure.
Like there's this like it's and maybe that's also like kind of disgusting, but in a way where it highlights the absurdism of the medium and of the industry. Like, it's almost a joke how Evil Dead 2 came to be, right? Like, they literally just didn't have any money to make what they wanted, because they had like a flop with a Crime Wave, co-produced with and written with the Coen brothers in '85. And so literally it was this assistant director that happened to be working for Dino De Laurentiis, and then Stephen King heard an earshot that like Raimi and who is the other, the main Scott Spiegel, who co-wrote the screenplay, like they had wanted to do it, and just because De Laurentiis was made of money at the time, and Stephen King was a big fan of the first Evil Dead, that's how they get it made. And so I can imagine like being in that kind of scenario as an up and coming director who had just like played a horrible prank on Hollywood by following up a promising debut with a big stinker. Okay, I'm not even going to worry about story, about emotional beats. Like, I'm just going to try to put my guy Bruce through the ringer and hope that that's enough. And I mean, and it is for so many people that I think that story that's being told is more behind the scenes than what's actually happening with Ash and like the character of Linda, who he like, I love Bruce's his dialogue is almost just as good. His dialogue delivery is almost just as good as his physical comedy, because like when he's like holding the necklace and like saying Linda's name, it's just it's priceless. And I think it's even more hilarious on like a meta narrative level that even after it seemed like the Evil Dead well had dried up, 20 years later, Raimi brings him back for a TV series.
I mean, he's a living cartoon, and I think that just kind of fits with the tone of this movie. And I guess thinking about, you mentioned Crime Wave, and Evil Dead the first one doesn't have much of a plot. Crime Wave is a nothing plot, but it's filled with so many funny gags that are just this sort of Looney Tunes / Three Stooges type of aesthetic that he pulls into this, and then he does sort of the same thing on Army of Darkness after this, and Darkman. And that has more of a plot, I think. And then after that, he really kind of takes a step back from the aesthetics, and he starts becoming a storyteller more with his stuff in the mid to late 90s. And he's just had a weird trajectory in his career, to where oddly the most like Sam Raimi movie becomes, Spider-Man or Spider-Man 2, where he's using all these aesthetic tricks and telling a story um, in in a way that both feel very relative to him. It's kind of strange that Spider-Man feels so much like a Sam Raimi movie based on kind of the progression of his career.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, Peter Jackson also had a strange trajectory here, right? Like, he
Yeah.
goes from this stuff to like, I mean, like, Two Towers is probably the biggest movie in the world. It felt like it at the time, at least. But yeah, it's still those connections there. Still some of that, like you were saying, the close-ups in The Hobbit and stuff felt very similar. I'm kind of interested, maybe to close this out here, like, just kind of knowing you, especially Brian, like, what makes, both these films would be considered cult films, I would think. How would you sort of define that here, and like what makes them cult films to you?
So I mean, there's at least at the time to what was considered mainstream. There's just this alternativeness or all the technical innovations, the one-upmanship kind of that I mentioned before, or just really kind of being transgressive in terms of how much blood we can put on screen.
Yeah.
And then really it's just kind of like how they're consumed. If these were huge movies that were earning, tons of money at the box office, I don't think they would be cult films. But it's because of that rare time in movie consumption history where you could go and get a VHS or rent the movie and kind of talk about it with your friends or see it at a midnight show that makes these cult movies. And you mentioned the Ash versus Evil Dead TV series. Between that and the fact that I can go to Target right now and buy a stuffed Ash figure from the collector section near the movie aisle, like I don't think Evil Dead is a cult thing anymore. I feel like it's way too popular. Whereas Dead Alive is still very much, I can't go get a Lionel action figure at Target. And it's kind of hard to find. Like I have a DVD that I bought in the early 2000s, and that's how I watched it. I don't know. I couldn't actually find it streaming. I didn't look very hard, but I know there was a Blu-ray release, but it's out of print. And Jackson has talked about has talked about doing a restoration, but it's kind of hard to find.
Yeah, there's 3 different really poor transfers on YouTube, and
Okay.
I think that's but like each of these uploads have like hundreds of thousands of views.
Yeah,
Sure.
And it's insane that like it's just like out there for popular consumption, and by the maker of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies.
Yeah.
And yet it's still just kind of like this gem that is essentially a footnote for mainstream movie lovers, and yet there's still like this rabid fan base, and like the legacy of Dead Alive in many ways for that kind of very that very narrow subset of horror fans, splatter fans, like Shudder subscribers. It's there, like on you see it on Letterboxd, you see it on Bloody Disgusting and Dread Central. So like I think that there's like I was kind of saying earlier, there's this longevity to both of these films, and for whatever reason, because I don't know if it's the Spider-Man aspect or just because like Raimi is a lot more upfront about it. I almost feel like Jackson even talked about in the interview where he talks about restoring Dead Alive for a new Blu-ray release using the same techniques that he used for his World War I documentary. I forget the name of it. So like I think a second life is on the horizon if Jackson ever gets his shit together and actually helps make this happen. It's just that Evil Dead is so much more prevalent.
I think the ability for something to become cult has kind of, because art, the culture is so fragmented as it is, and everybody, there are people who subscribe to Netflix and there are people who just use Amazon Prime or HBO Max, and that's just what they watch is on one of those subscription services. So something to become a cult object these days seems more difficult because part of the appeal is that it's not mainstream, and there is no mainstream anymore, I don't think. At least outside of, superhero movies. And so I feel like when Jackson eventually puts out this Blu-ray and it appears on Shudder again and it's accessible, people are going to watch it like crazy, and it's not going to feel culty anymore. It's not going to feel dangerous anymore. Whereas I don't know that. I feel like there's an audience for Dead Alive, whereas like Meet the Feebles and Bad Taste, which came before this, are never going to, like, those will always feel like cult movies because I can't see a huge audience watching Meet the Feebles and just enjoying it. Whereas I can see today's horror audience really embracing this. And in a way, kind of horror has become very mainstream today. And I think if you're a part of the mainstream, it's not a cult. It's not a cult thing. So Midsummer is not a cult movie. That's a widely embraced movie critically and commercially.
Plot wise, it's a cult movie, but yeah, I know what you mean.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I kind of dread them as much as I want to see a restored version of this. I sort of enjoyed.
Yeah.
I rewatched this last night on my shitty DVD that it doesn't have the best transfer, and I kind of enjoyed watching it like that. That is a cult movie. Yeah.
There's like this. It's almost like a dirty little secret.
Right. And we don't get enough. We don't get enough of those now because everything's available to everyone.
Yeah. And when this comes out on DVD or Blu-ray or whatever, I guarantee you on the Dreadit subreddit of horror fans, every day someone's going to post, "Oh man, you was Dead Alive before? It's amazing!" Like some 20-year-old, it's the greatest.
Yeah.
Oh man, and the cult of Mystique will be gone. Brian, thanks for being on this episode. It was fantastic. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And you're got new reviews coming out pretty much like almost every day, man. You're prolific.
Thanks. I try to do a couple a week, and then every probably 2 or 3 weeks do a larger essay. And then I also have a Patreon, which is just Patreon/Deep Focus Review.
Very cool. We'll check that out. Thanks for listening. This has been Film Trace.